Good, good evening. Good evening. I had a misstart on Auguries of Innocence earlier today, so I'm going to begin tonight's 115th session of the Carl Jung Depth Psychology Reading Group by reading Auguries of Innocence by William Blake. To see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wildflower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. A robin redbreast in a cage puts all heaven in a rage. A dove house filled with doves and pigeons shudders hell through its regions. A dog starved at its master's gate predicts the ruin of the state. A horse misused upon the road calls to heaven for human blood. Each outcry of the haunted hare, a fiber from the brain must tear. A skylark wounded in the wing, a cherubim does cease to sing. The gamecock, clipped and armed for fight, does the rising sun affright. Every wolf's and lion's howl raises from heaven a human soul. The wild deer wandering here and there keeps the human soul from care. The lamb misused breeds public strife and yet forgives the butcher's knife. The bat that flits at close of eve has left the brain that won't believe. The owl that calls upon the night speaks the unbeliever's fright. He who shall hurt the little wren shall never be beloved of men. He who the ox to wrath has moved shall never be by woman loved. The wanton boy that kills the fly shall feel the spider's enmity. He who torments the chaffer's sprite weaves a bower in endless night. The caterpillar on the leaf repeats to thee thy mother's grief. Kill not the moth nor butterfly, for the last judgment draweth nigh. He who shall train the horse to war shall never pass the polar bar. The beggar's dog and widow's cat, feed them and thou wilt grow fat. The gnat that sings his summer song poison gets from slander's tongue. The poison of the snake and newt is the sweat of envy's foot. The poison of the honeybee is the artist's jealousy. The prince's robes and beggar's rags are toadstools on the miser's bags. A truth that's told with bad intent beats all the lies you can invent. It is right, it should be. Man was made for joy and woe, and when this we rightly know, through the world we safely go. Joy and woe are woven fine, a clothing for the soul divine. Under every grief and pine runs a joy with silken twine. The babe is more than swaddling bands throughout all these human lands. Tools were made and born were hands, every farmer understands. Every tear from every eye becomes a babe in eternity. This is caught by females bright and returned to its own delight. The bleat and bark, bellow and roar are waves that beat on heaven's shore. The babe that weeps the rod beneath writes revenge in realms of death. The beggar's rags fluttering in air does to rags the heavens tear. The soldier armed with sword and gun palsied strikes the summer sun. The poor man's farthing is worth more than all the golds on Afric's shore. One mite wrung from the laborer's hands shall buy and sell the miser's lands? Or if protected from on high, does that whole nation sell and buy? He who mocks the infant's faith shall be mocked in age and death. He who shall teach the child to doubt the rotting grave shall ne'er get out. He who respects the infant's faith triumphs over hell and death. The child's toys and the old man's reasons are the fruits of the two seasons. The questioner who sits so sly shall never know how to reply. He who replies to words of doubt doth put the light of knowledge out. The strongest poison ever known came from Caesar's laureled crown. Naught can deform the human race, like to the armor's iron brace. When gold and gems adorn the plow, to peaceful art shall envy bow. A riddle or the cricket's cry is to doubt a fit reply. The emmet's inch and eagle's mile make lame philosophy to smile. He who doubts from what he sees will ne'er believe. Do what you please. If the sun and moon should doubt, they'd immediately go out. To be in a passion you good may do, but no good if a passion is in you. The whore and gambler by the state license build the nation's fate. The harlot's cry from street to street shall weave old England's winding sheet. Shall weave old England, the winners shout the loser's curse, dance before dead England's hearse. Every night and every morn, some to misery are born. Every morn and every night, some are born to sweet delight. Some are born to sweet delight. Some are born to endless night. We are led to believe a lie when we see not through the eye, which was born in a night to perish in a night, when the soul slept in beams of light. God appears, and God is light to those poor souls who dwell in night, but does a human form display to those who dwell in realms of day. So, that was Auguries of Innocence by William Blake. I read that in response to a request from one of our subscribers, and I got the poem from the Poetry Foundation, and let me just read you one paragraph. I wanted to print out one paragraph of the William Blake story, and I ended up with 53 pages of his story, so I'll just read the first paragraph. In his Life of William Blake, 1863, Alexander Gilchrist warned his readers that Blake neither wrote nor drew for the many, hardly for workaday men at all, rather for children and angels, himself a divine child, whose playthings were sun, moon, and stars, the heaven and the earth. Yet Blake himself believed that his writings were of national importance, and that they could be understood by a majority of men. Far from being an isolated mystic, Blake lived and worked in the teeming metropolis of London at a time of great social and political change that profoundly influenced his writing. After the peace established in 1762, the British Empire seemed secure, but the storm wave begun with the American Revolution in 1775 and the French Revolution in 1789 changed forever the way men looked at their relationship to the state and to the established church. Poet, painter, and engraver, Blake worked to bring about a change both in the social order and in the minds of men. Now, one further thing I would mention is that long before Carl Jung or Sigmund Freud were even alive, William Blake did a 21-plate series on the book of Job, which basically predicted modern psychology as it's discussed by Carl Jung. And you can hear Edward Edinger's discussion of that on the front page of this YouTube channel. If you look for two videos called Edinger's Portable Analytic Hour, because Edward Edinger wrote a short book called Encounters with the Self, in which he described what each of Blake's plates meant in terms of the book of Job. And it turns out that that's basically what he would help people understand in an analytic hour. So it's very useful in that way. So good evening and welcome to our weekly session. I'm happy to have a discussion with you as we go. A couple of things to mention while I'm waiting for you to respond. One is this set of books called Catafalque by Peter Kingsley, Carl Jung and the End of Humanity. Quite a profound statement. And it's a 2-volume set. Volume 1 contains the narrative, and volume 2 contains all the footnotes. And so I urge you to take a look at this book. It's a very interesting book. I'm about a quarter of the way through it and may comment on it at a later time. But catafalque means a structure on which you place a coffin. And this image on the front of the book is called the flower of Chernobyl. And you see various people falling off the catafalque of humanity there. Now, good evening, and before I get into tonight's session on psychology and alchemy, let me mention that we've begun our weekly seminar in the advanced reading group on Mysterium Conjunctionis, which we conduct on Zoom. This text is complicated, but extremely interesting when we know that Dr. Jung found the medieval alchemical images show up in modern dreams and help us understand what our self is trying to say to us through dreams and visions. Last week we completed the second session on this, and the first two sessions are already on playback. Also, all of the 32 weekly seminar sessions we have completed on Ion, researches into the phenomenology of the self, and Mysterium Conjunctionis are available to all members of the advanced reading group. And you just have to write to skip.conover@gmail.com to be added to the group. Please support this YouTube channel by sharing videos you like with your social network, particularly Reddit, Twitter, and Facebook. And also please subscribe below. We want to maintain the benchmark of having more than 50% of our viewers as subscribers. We also welcome Super Chat sponsorships on all live streams and Patreon sponsorships. And I will be talking about that in some more depth at a future time, very soon. I'm going to tell the story of how the American financial community, particularly Wall Street, managed to get itself paid double on all defaulted mortgages. And most people don't know this, most foreclosures were done fraudulently. And I know this because I've been fighting foreclosure on my own home for the last 7 years. And I knew that I was going to lose very likely since 2015, but I soldiered on. Myself made me do it. And the purpose was to get the entire story on the record in the courthouse. And so now I have done that, and I can prove that the financial industry managed to get themselves paid double, and they basically harvested the life savings of the baby boom and many others. And so this is a story that needs to be told, and I'm prepared to tell it in detail at some future time. At this point, I have officially had my home foreclosed, and it's a very long story. When my paternal grandfather was alive, I didn't really think much of him. At the time, I thought he was an alcoholic, and he was a very rough sort of guy. I sort of saw him as Willie Loman from Death of a Salesman, and in fact, he did serve much of the end of his life as a traveling salesman. And he was born in 1900, so he had a life that was filled with alcohol and lots of cigarettes. So he had a stroke when he was 58 years old, and he died when he was 68 on the same weekend that I was married the first time. And so it's only later that I learned to respect and appreciate through my own experience what he had been through. He had built up his own business through the 1920s. And when the crash came, he lost that business. And then he lost his home. And so it must have been very tough for him during the Depression. But the one thing that he did that was of particular import for me was that he got my father into the U.S. Naval Academy, so that my father spent all of World War II in the Naval Academy, which was very fortunate because I'm probably here as a result of that. And so now that I've been through my own foreclosure process, I also understand how he must have felt, because I've experienced it directly myself, in terms of what the financial community did to him, because the government, the Bush administration, saved the banking industry during the crash of 2008, but they left all of the middle class out to dry. And I think it's very possible that the same thing can happen again. So I want to put people on warning about that. And there are some legal things that can be done over all these fraudulent foreclosures. But anyway, I'm not going to go into that in great detail tonight. Now, why did I read the poetry? Well, first of all, I was asked to read that poem and a few others which I've read during the past week. But the point about poetry is that it opens a space in your psyche that allows something new to happen. And one of Dr. Jung's favorite quotes from the Bible is when Jesus says to the throng, unless you come as little children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. And the reason for that is that if you are an adult and your ways are set, you're very sclerotic in your thinking, then you can't really learn anything new. But little children do learn things new, and so they are able to understand what is happening and learn new ways of thinking. Now, one of the people on YouTube that's been very successful, obviously, over the last couple of years has been Professor Jordan Peterson of the University of Toronto. And what he has done, among other things, which is very valuable, is that he has opened up and made people see what religion was about. And as a result of that, many people have been drawn back to religion. And the reason is because he's opened up some space in people's minds and let them think about what religion actually means and what the idea of God and the God image actually means. These are some of the topics that we're going to be talking about tonight. But one of the issues, particularly in Christianity, is the problem of the Word and the idea that the Bible must be 100% physically true. And Dr. Jung, one of the main things that he did in his career was open up space for people to think about the fact that all religious statements are true. However, they're not true in the physical world. They're true in the psychic world. And so if I pick up Answer to Job, which is one of his seminal works, this one, Answer to Job, he says, it does not matter at all that a physically impossible fact is asserted, because all religious assertions are physical impossibilities. If they were not so, they would, as I said earlier, necessarily be treated in the textbooks of natural science. But religious statements, without exception, have to do with the reality of the psyche and not with the reality of the physis. And so when Dr. Jung is talking about helping people see, he's trying to help people see that fact, and it makes a great deal of difference. And you've heard me comment a few times probably on Jordan Peterson, on his insistence upon the logos, on rationality, and against chaos. But the problem is it's not chaos, and it's not the feminine, it's life that we're talking about. And so when any teacher teaches you something, they're teaching you a rule or a concept, but there's no life in that concept. You have to bring the life to that concept. And so I wanted to refer back to Ion for a minute, to paragraph 63 in Ion, Researches into the Phenomenology of the Self, where Dr. Jung makes a very important point. He says, it is not the concept that matters. The concept is only a word, a counter, and it has meaning and use only because it stands for a certain sum of experience. In other words, a concept has no meaning at all until there's experience with it. And in that same paragraph, which is one of my favorite paragraphs in the Jungian oeuvre, he's talking about concepts, and he gives an example. He says, philosophical criticism will find everything to object to in them, and he's talking about the shadow, the syzygy, and the self, unless it begins by recognizing that they are concerned with facts, that the concept is simply an abbreviated description or definition of these facts. Such criticism has as little effect on the object as zoological criticism on a duck-billed platypus. So the point is that, the zoologist can write any number of books about the duck-billed platypus, but the duck-billed platypus goes right on living all by itself, and it doesn't need any zoological criticism. And so all those books mean absolutely nothing to the life of the duck-billed platypus. And so we all have to understand that when we learn something, when we are studying something in school, we're learning concepts, but those concepts are based on experience. And those concepts only mean something to us when we put our own personal experience into them. And so, whatever you can learn from Jordan Peterson, have at it, both from his psychological perspective. Obviously he wrote a book called Maps of Meaning, which is a brilliant book, but it is extremely tightly packed. If you're not really interested in psychology, you might bounce off of it. But it's a brilliant book, and he said that he had written it for, I think, 15 years, and that he had been over every sentence of the book 10 or 15 times, and it certainly shows that he did do that. But the problem is it's so tightly packed that only, it has to be the basis of at least a 1 semester long course. I think he has on his YouTube channel something like 20 or 30 videos of him teaching from Maps of Meaning at Harvard some years ago. So, welcome everyone. Everyone's quiet tonight. So I'm happy to talk with you about any topic in the Jungian realm, but if you don't raise any issues, then I'll just go on and talk to the camera and hope what I say is meaningful to you. So now I'm going to go over to this Alchemy, Psychology and Alchemy by C.G. Jung, which is volume 12 of the collected works of C.G. Jung. And I'm up to paragraph 15 of this book. And what I'm working toward in this group on Monday evenings is working through this book over the coming year or so, but in a very detailed way. So I'll step out to have any conversation with you that might be appropriate about any issue in Jungian psychology that might be of interest to you. But also I'm going to, as there are spaces when you're not raising any issues, I'm going to go through this book for you. So tonight is the 5th evening in which I've been working on the book, and it's quite a complicated task. So Dr. Jung was, one of the things that he was struggling with throughout his life was the idea that psychology might be a heretical doctrine, or he might be trying to set up a separate religion. And that wasn't true at all. I mean, in the spirit of Jordan Peterson, he was just trying to make people see what he was talking about, and the fact that these narratives in the psyche are actually true. The biblical stories are actually true, but they're not true up here or down here. They're true here, and they're true in the heart. They're true in you. And so this is kind of what Jordan Peterson is getting at when he tells his biblical stories, and it's partially what Dr. Jung is talking about here, that he is trying to help people see that that's a fact. And this is after about 2,000 years where theologians of all stripes have been projecting God and all these other religious entities outside of yourself. So certainly I was brought up in that way, and like any kid, I was told that God was up here and that the devil was going to come and get me and so on if I was a bad little boy. And that has been quite damaging in many ways over the years. But so anyway, in paragraph 15 now, Dr. Jung says, another equally serious misunderstanding lies in imputing to psychology the wish to be a new and possibly heretical doctrine. If the blind man can gradually be helped to see, it is not to be expected that he will at once discern new truths with an eagle eye. One must be glad if he sees anything at all. And if he begins to understand what he sees, psychology is concerned with the act of seeing and not with the construction of new religions. So this is Dr. Jung's response to those issues. And when even the existing teachings have not yet been perceived and understood. So he's commenting that most Christians were not perceiving and understanding what religion was really about, and the theologians weren't helping them because they were trying to interpose themselves between the individual and God so that they would get paid. It's their livelihood. And they got paid pretty well, because if you go to St. Peter's in Rome or look at a picture of it, you see how grandly they were paid over the last 2,000 years. It took time. So in religious matters, it is a well-known fact that we cannot understand a thing until we have experienced it inwardly, for it is the inward experience that the connection between the psyche and the outward image or creed is first revealed as a relationship or correspondence, that of sponsus and sponsa. So what he's saying is that you have to be moved inwardly. Now, I can't say whether someone who's moved at a Billy Graham revival or something like that, are they really moved? Have they really been made to see what the religion is, or have they been made to see something that is not quite accurate, that's really designed to get the pastor paid? It's a good question. So he says, accordingly, when I say as a psychologist that God is an archetype, I mean by that the type in the psyche. So he's talking about the self, the God image, and that's what he can refer to. He's not talking about the metaphysical God. The word type is, as we know, derived from blow or imprint, typos, blow or imprint. That's the Greek. Thus, an archetype presupposes an imprinter. Psychology, as the science of the soul, has to confine itself to its subject and guard against overstepping its proper boundaries by metaphysical assertions or other professions of faith. So what Dr. Jung was saying here is that he could find all these biblical images in the psyche of his patients, and he discussed 80,000 dreams in his lifetime with his patients. So he knew what was there, and he could discuss those with his patients. But if it came down to saying, what was there before the Big Bang or something like that in terms of our modern terminology, you couldn't possibly do that. And he basically said that would be exceeding the competence of the psychologist. So he was well aware that theology had put some stories on top of what psychologists knew about the self, but he didn't want to get into that fight. Now, from my perspective, I think that was a mistake, because I think that the fundamental issue we have right now, and I'm seeing it everywhere now that I've seen it, is this issue between logos and life. And unfortunately, it was put together as a set of opposites between logos and eros. Now, by using the term eros, obviously that suggests the idea of erotica or some negative idea about women or femininity, which is not justified. And the problem is that once you have these rigid structures, you don't have life. And there was a very poignant passage last night that I watched. Deb and I watched Three Identical Strangers, which is a documentary video that was put together by CNN. And it was about a set of triplets who did not know of each other. They were abandoned, and they were adopted by three different families. One was a doctor, one was a middle-class teacher, and one was a store owner, and sort of in the lower class. But by one thing leads to another, and this happened in New York City. So two of the triplets found one another. And so that became a big story, that they had found one another, and their picture as twins was put on the cover of, I think, the New York Post or one of those newspapers. And when that was published, it was immediately realized within a day that there was another one, and that there were actually triplets. And so these guys got together, and they were very, very happy for a time to have one another and to be able to know one another. And the first discovery had been when they were 19, and they had built a restaurant in Soho in New York City, and they had good success. The first year they did $1 million worth of business. But in the end, it's a long story, and it's worth taking a look at this documentary called Three Identical Strangers. It's available on demand on cable now. But in the end, one of these fellows committed suicide. And it turned out that his father, his adopted father, had been a strict disciplinarian and very rigid in his way of thinking about the world. And he was being interviewed for this documentary, and he says, well, I taught him everything, but maybe I didn't teach him how to live. And that's the point, that, rules and strict discipline and all that aren't about living. And, I pridefully say that I served 23 years in the Marine Corps, active and reserve. And, the Marine Corps isn't about eros, it's about logos, and about when you're given a command, you do exactly what you're told and nothing else. And so in that sense, the Marine Corps and the armed forces are tools to be used by some other person who's wiser than us, presumably, who is telling us what to do as a tool. But as a tool, there is no room for eros at all. There's no room at all. You just follow the rules and you follow your commands, and that's it. And there's any number of videos on YouTube about Marine Corps training, and so you'll see what I mean. And there was sort of this tongue-in-cheek statement that I was aware of, which said, if the Marine Corps had wanted you to have a wife, it would have issued you one. And this would come up at times when Marines would get in problems with their spouses often, one way or another. And, boys will be boys. And they, and so in the Marine Corps, they're not teaching you how to live the other side of your life, the yin side of your life. They teach you the yang, but not the yin. And so the point is that we're all opposites, and we have to learn to live with the opposite. And we have to learn to, based on the thesis and antithesis, based on what we are and the antithesis, which is what our spouse is, male or female, then from that conflict, and it is a bit of a conflict, comes a synthesis, which is your married couple-ness. And so when that synthesis comes through, that's life. And that's what we fail to teach young people today, it seems to me. But in any case, that's a long story, but I think you get the point. If you have any questions about it, do let me know. But anyway, Dr. Jung says when he teaches someone to see what the Gospels actually mean and what they're referring to, he says nothing positive or negative has thereby been asserted about the possible existence of God, any more than the archetype of the hero posits the actual existence of a hero. And so I think we all are aware these days of the hero archetype that became very popular after Star Wars came out in the mid-70s. And, just because there is such a thing as the archetype of the hero doesn't mean there is a hero present. And the hero is somebody that's willing to step out from the collective and make some change. That's a hero. So, let me go on. So I'm now up to paragraph 16. Now, if my psychological researches have demonstrated the existence of a certain psychic types and their correspondence with well-known religious ideas, then we have opened up a possible approach to those experienceable contents, which manifestly and undeniably form the empirical foundations of all religious experience. The religious-minded man is free to accept whatever metaphysical explanations he pleases about the origin of these images, not so the intellect. And so what Dr. Jung is, let's say, nobody can prevent the believer from accepting God, Purusha, or Atman, or the Tao as the prime cause, and thus putting an end to the fundamental disquiet of man. The scientist is a scrupulous worker. He cannot take heaven by storm. And so he's basically denying that he was taking a religious position. Now, Anne Ulanoff, I've spoken of her and her books. I don't have them all, but one of them is The Living God and Our Living Psyche. And what I think that Dr. Jung did was, after Nietzsche said that God was dead in the end of the 19th century, Jung came along and demonstrated the existence of a living God, where he lives and how he goes about doing his work. And Ulanoff felt the same thing. What Christians can learn from Carl Jung is the name of this book. But she also commented that he fell for the devil's trick, which was that there's this logical side of life and there's the life side of life. And he never threw a rope across, let alone a rope ladder or a bridge. And that's what she has done in her work for the last 40 years, because, as you probably know, she was emerita professor of psychiatry and religion at Union Theological Seminary, one of the leading theological seminaries in the country. And so she knows her business from both sides. And that's what needs to be done. We have to understand ourselves and what our religions really do for us, and not just take it on faith that there's this kindly father that you can pray to and he's going to let you have a touchdown or something like that. That doesn't work. It doesn't work that way. Prayer works, but it works in a different way. And if you've been following these videos along, you probably will understand that prayer is a petition to yourself to get something to happen, but it isn't, it's not effective if you think it's a puppeteer that's up there pulling the strings and making it possible for you to have anything that you're asking for. It doesn't work that way. The way it works is it puts into yourself, the desire and the effort to do that. So perhaps it does make you make that touchdown, but it's because it also made you do 100 pull-ups a week and 500 push-ups a week and run 50 miles a week and so on, until you built yourself up to the point that you could be a good football player. And that was a process that happened over a long period of time. If you're a professional football or a college football player, it didn't happen today when you said your prayers. It happened maybe as you said your prayers, but over a 5 or 10 or 15 year period before you got to that point. So, paragraph 17, Dr. Jung says, the fact is that with the knowledge and actual experience of these inner images, a way is open for reason and feeling to gain access to those other images which the teachings of religion offer to mankind. Psychology thus does just the opposite of what it is accused of. It provides possible approaches to a better understanding of these things. It opens people's eyes to the real meaning of dogmas. And far from destroying, it throws open an empty house to new inhabitants. I can corroborate this from countless experiences. People belonging to creeds of all imaginable kinds who had played the apostate or cooled off in their faith have found a new approach to their old truths. Not a few Catholics among them, even a Parsi, found the way back to Zoroastrian fire temple, which should bear witness to the objectivity of my point of view. And so what he's saying is that this religious function is in the deep psyche of every human being, regardless of creed. And by understanding what he was saying about psychology, it makes the religious knowledge possible. And so, the truth about the existence of God can be known. The very profound video that we've mentioned a few times on YouTube, where Dr. Jung is asked, do you believe in God? And this is, mind you, after he's 75 or so years old, or maybe 80, and his father had been a Swiss Reformed pastor, and his 7 uncles had been pastors. And so he was asked whether he believed in God as a child, and did he go to church? And he says, oh yes, we all did that. And then he's asked, do you believe in God now? And he says, very complicated. I have no need to believe because I know. And for me, that was an epiphany, because I realized that I knew at that moment. And once you know, then it never leaves you. You don't need a creed. I don't go to church, but I do know, and that makes me a better human being, in my view, than just trying to run along behind Mama trying to understand what the catechism is today or something like that. Let's see. Okay, so in paragraph 18, he says, but this objectivity is just what my psychology is most blamed for. It is said not to decide in favor of this or that religious doctrine. Without prejudice to my own subjective convictions, I should like to raise the question. Is it not thinkable that when one refrains from setting oneself up as an arbiter mundi and deliberately renouncing all subjectivism, cherishes, on the contrary, the belief, for instance, that God has expressed himself in many languages and appeared in diverse forms, and that all these statements are true? Is it not thinkable? I say that this too is a decision, The objection raised, more particularly by Christians, that it is impossible for contradictory statements to be true, must permit itself to be politely asked, does 1 equal 3? How can 3 be 1? Can a mother be a virgin? And so on. Has it not yet been observed that all religious statements contain logical contradictions and assertions that are impossible in principle, that this is in fact the very essence of religious assertion? Okay, so what he's saying is that these paradoxes are the essence of religion, and it's the same type of idea as comes up in poetry. As I'm reading Auguries of Innocence earlier in this hour, as I spoke those images, they open up a space, and in that space is where something new can come into your own mind. So let me just give you an example. And this is what poetry does for you. It opens up space. So to see a world in a grain of sand. And so all of a sudden, that's a whole new idea just in the very first line of this poem. And a heaven in a wildflower. Okay, so if you suddenly your unconscious is working on this idea of heaven being in a wildflower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. So just imagine if you're with your dying parent, for example, and you know that within the hour they will be dead, then for them, eternity is in that hour, and for you as well, because there's no going back, and you hold the infinite possibilities of what can happen between you and your parent in the palm of your hand in that very hour. And then he says, a robin redbreast in a cage puts all heaven in a rage. Okay, so here he's talking about stopping instinct by putting a bird in a cage so that it can't live its life the way the bird could do. So all of these words that open up and cause connections through your psyche, a lot of different things are happening in your psyche while you're listening to a poem like that. And it opens up a space for letting God come in, letting life come into your life. And obviously, the ideas that are presented in this poem are never real in the physical sense. You can't logic it out, because to logic it out, okay, we could probably write a book about this poem where we somehow discussed all the imagery in this poem, but even then we wouldn't get it and wouldn't get what it meant to us. And so the significance of this and of religious ideas as well is that they open space in our psyches to allow life to come in, very frankly. And so it's very important for us to come to life with that perspective and to understand that there is much more than just the concepts that our teachers teach us, because they can't live our lives for us. Only we can live our lives. And they can give us guidelines. They can say, well, this is, you're an American, or you're British, or you're Australian, or or you're Zimbabwean or whatever it is, and this is the world you live in today. So we can learn the world we live in, but then we have to live our lives and within the context of what's happening in that society. And what's happening in that society is different for everyone. As I've indicated a few times, if you go to India, you find the 21st century overlaying over the 12th century. And so some people are living more or less like Americans live in some way, maybe not quite as clean and perfect as we find our communities, but still pretty good, and nobody really objects. And so we find those people and living right next to people who are still living in dirt floor huts made out of Coca-Cola cases, that sort of thing. And so each of us has to learn to live in our own society. Okay, that's kind of the rules, that's the given. But then when you do that, you can do a lot of different things. You can, in India, you can try to help the poor in some way, or you can go and work in Nariman Point in Mumbai and be the Wall Street investment banker for India. I happen to know a woman who was the chief drug enforcement officer for Western India, which included Mumbai. And so she had in her jurisdiction more Indians than there are Americans. And her job as drug enforcement officer was not a lot different from what our drug czar is in the U.S. But on the other hand, if you look at a Indian village, their life is quite different. And so they have to learn to live in a different way, and they have different problems that they need to face if they want to try to break out of their cultural norm. And so poetry, some of these ideas that Dr. Jung is talking about also, is about breaking away from the logos and learning how to live life, to break away from the standard that everybody believes in. Maya, you've been awfully silent tonight. Does anyone have any comment whatsoever about anything that I've been saying? Usually I have a few by now. Anyway, but if you don't want to talk, don't talk. So anyway, Dr. Jung is just pointing out the hypocrisy of a religious leader who complains about the questions he asks, but then provides facts that are obviously not facts in the physical world. They're psychic facts. You know, the idea of the Virgin Mary is a very lovely one as a psychic fact. It's not a physical fact, though. And so in the physical world, even today, if a woman was pregnant before marriage, she could very easily be stoned to death even today. And, you know, that was the problem that was faced by, and it was also the problem that was faced by her fiance, Joseph. And I don't know what's happened to my screen. Okay. And So the miracle was that they both had a dream that about being impregnated by God himself. And it's a lovely dream, myth, and it worked. It let her survive. And so the miracle is that it could happen and she could survive and she could deliver her child. But it's not true in the physical world. It's true in the psychic world. And I know that that is probably blasphemy for some of you, but sorry, we're talking about psychology here. We're not talking about the truths and lack thereof in religion. Okay, so what I will say is that every religious statement of whatever kind is a statement of the psyche, and they're all true. And they're all true for every religion. And so just the fact that they're somewhat different, they have a different patina on them, is not really very relevant. So anyway, moving on. So he says here, if Christianity demands faith in such contradictions, it does not seem to me that it can very well condemn those who assert a few paradoxes more. Oddly enough, the paradox is one of our most valuable spiritual possessions, while uniformity of meaning is a sign of weakness. And so the paradox is that we all need to live with one another, and we can live with one another, even though we all have different ideas about these types of issues, about the God image and about virgin birth or what have you. So he says, hence a religion becomes inwardly impoverished when it loses or waters down its paradoxes, but their multiplication enriches because only the paradox comes anywhere near to comprehending the fullness of life. And so as I was reading Auguries of Innocence, you are experiencing the living truth of your own psyche, because I can't predict what images would have come to your mind, but I do know that through the reading of that poem, everyone would have had different images coming to mind all the time. And so those new images that are coming because they're anchored in your psyche, that's the living psyche there. And that's where the living God is also. So he says, non-ambiguity and non-contradiction are one-sided and thus unsuited to express the incomprehensible. And so this is the point, even though I can say the things that I've said and nobody wants to take me on. The fact is that religious life and life itself is coming from living actions that are taking place in your psyche all the time. And we're only even aware of the barest few of them, actually. Let's see. So then he starts to comment on, in paragraph 19, about the idea that after the Enlightenment, things went downhill for the Christian myth, because we started to have the scientific method come through, which started to punch holes in Christian myth and myth in all religions. So he says, things have gone rapidly downhill since the Age of Enlightenment. For once, this petty reasoning mind, which cannot endure any paradoxes, is awakened. No sermon on earth can keep it down. A new task then arises, to lift this still undeveloped mind step by step to a higher level, and to increase the number of persons who have at least some inkling of the scope of the paradoxical truth. If this is not possible, then it must be admitted that the spiritual approaches to Christianity are as good as blocked. We simply do not understand anymore what is meant by the paradoxes contained in dogma, and the more external our understanding of them becomes, the more we are affronted by their irrationality, until finally they become completely obsolete, curious relics of the past. The man who is stricken in this way cannot estimate the extent of his spiritual loss, because he has never experienced the sacred images as his inmost possession, and has never realized their kinship with his own psychic structure. So the point is, and we've talked about it quite a lot in this group over the last couple of years, is that it's necessary to have a religious experience in some way, and I don't prescribe how it happens. I've offered a few examples on the website, on the YouTube channel, where I caught myself on video having such an experience, not because it will resonate as the same experience for you, but it is an example that affected me, so you can see how I was affected by my personal religious experience. Now, I can't help you do yours. I mean, one of the ideas that Dr. Edinger was asked about this during his lecture on Individuation, the myth for modern man, he was asked, how do you have such an experience? And he said that you have to experience the opposites, and you have to reflect on what you love and hate. And when you do that, you admit the existence of both your position and the other position. So we could see that in terms of American politics these days. I mean, we're all Americans, but about half of us have a blue position and half of us have a red position, something like that. And so we have to think about what's right in the other guy's position. So we have the thesis and the antithesis. And what we need as a people, as the American people, is that we need to produce a synthesis from that, because that is the Holy Spirit, if you will, coming through and providing us with an answer. Now, Dr. Jung believed very strongly that these answers come through in the form of dreams and visions, because, if my side is all this way and your side is all that way, and that's what we've been taught, and we just can't give up our position, then we don't solve our neurosis. And we don't necessarily consciously have a way of getting out of it. I mean, if any of you can tell me how we're going to get out of the red-blue dichotomy in the U.S., please pass it on, and pass it on to our leaders and to me, because I don't know. But what Dr. Jung's position is that the psyche would present a solution in the form of a symbol of some sort. And these come up in dreams and visions, and it does it spontaneously. It's organic, and it's part of our nature in life. And, what he's saying is that our so-called 2 million-year-old man, it's actually a 3.5 billion-year-old man, because every one of us that can say or hear this is the direct descendant of single-celled organisms who, from the very beginning, successfully reproduced, down to today when I'm saying this and you're listening to it. There's been successful reproduction all of those years. Nobody failed to reproduce. And so, therefore, we can be here and do these things. And so, in terms of the evolution of the psyche, our psyche had to learn to live through all those ages and through all those developments. And so its understanding, the understanding of the unconscious, is quite broad. However, what it doesn't know is how we have to live in the 21st century. It has been developed over probably millions of generations to be a certain way, and it will produce some solutions. Always when we have a problem, our psyche will give us solutions, a good solution and a bad solution. And it's up to us, and our egos developed during the 21st century now, in the 20th century. It's up to us to then pick the right side of the stream and to make the ethical and correct decision. But those solutions come up to us through dreams and visions, through symbols and dreams and visions. And so if any one of us has such a dream or vision that is a solution out to the red state, blue state duality, please let me know. I'd appreciate it very much. So anyway, if any symbol comes to you that can solve it, let us know. So anyway, so Dr. Jung says here, were psychology bound to a creed, it would not and could not allow the unconscious of the individual that free play, which is the basic condition for the production of archetypes. It is precisely the spontaneity of archetypal contents that convinces, whereas any prejudiced intervention is a bar to genuine experience. So we have to have a religious experience in order to find a solution. If the theologian really believes in the almighty power of God on the one hand and in the validity of dogma on the other, why then does he not trust God to speak in the soul? Why this fear of psychology? Or is, in complete contradiction to dogma, the soul itself a hell from which only demons gibber? Even if this were really so, it would not be any the less convincing, for as we all know, the horrified perception of the reality of evil has led to at least as many conversions as the experience of good. And I would only refer you back to my experience with Mephistopheles, and based on that experience, that visioning experience, which thankfully, I was far enough down in my study of Jungian psychology so that I knew that that vision was a psychogenic experience, and not a physical experience that was actually happening, but something that I visioned, but it wasn't happening in the physical world. It was happening in my psyche. But, I'm sure that, fire and brimstone preachers over the years have convinced many a soul to come into the church based on having generated that kind of vision. And so I'm convinced that whoever taught my daughter to tell me that I was going to hell knew exactly what they were doing. And they were hoping that I would jump into the faith and write them a check. But unfortunately for them, I'm not quite so easily convinced in that way. But what I do acknowledge and know is that it must have happened to thousands or hundreds of thousands of people over the last 2 millennia. And that's one of the ways that the leaders have brought people into the church. I'm not saying that that's necessarily bad, considering the conditions of the world over that 2,000-year period. But I am saying that it does happen, and it's best if you know what's happening. So in paragraph 20 then, Dr. Jung says the archetypes of the unconscious can be shown empirically to be the equivalents of religious dogmas. In the hermeneutic language of the fathers of the church, that means the origins of knowledge of the fathers of the church, possesses a rich store of analogies with the individual and spontaneous products to be found in psychology. What the unconscious expresses is far from being merely arbitrary or opinionated. It is something that happens to be just so, as is the case with every other natural being. It stands to reason that the expressions of the unconscious are natural and not formulated dogmatically. They are exactly like the patristic allegories, which draw the whole of nature into the orbit of their amplifications. If these present us with some astonishing allegoriae Christi, Christian allegories, we find much the same sort of thing in the psychology of the unconscious. The only difference is that the patristic allegory refers to Christ, whereas the psychic allegory, the psychic archetype, is simply itself and can therefore be interpreted according to time, place, and milieu. In the West, the archetype is filled out with the dogmatic figure of Christ. In the East, with Purusha, the Atman, Hiranyagarbha, the Buddha, and so on. The religious point of view, understandably enough, puts the accent on the imprinter, whereas scientific psychology emphasizes the typos, the imprint, the only thing it can understand. The religious point of view understands the imprint as the working of an imprinter. The scientific point of view understands it as a symbol of an unknown and incomprehensible content. Since the typos is less definite and more variegated than any of the figures postulated by religion, psychology is compelled by its empirical material to express the typos by means of a terminology not bound by time, place, and milieu. If, for example, the typos agreed in every detail with the dogmatic figure of Christ, and if it contained no determinant that went beyond that figure, we would be bound to regard the typos as at least a faithful copy of the dogmatic figure and to name it accordingly. the typos would then coincide with Christ, but as experience shows, this is not the case, seeing that the unconscious, like the allegories implied by the Church Fathers, produces countless other determinants that are not explicitly contained in the dogmatic formula. That is to say, non-Christian figures such as those mentioned above are included in the typos, but neither do these figures comply with the indeterminate nature of the archetype. It is altogether inconceivable that there could be any definite figure capable of expressing archetypal indefiniteness. For this reason, I have found myself obliged to give the corresponding archetype the psychological name of the self, a term on the one hand definite enough to convey the essence of human wholeness, and on the other hand indefinite enough to express the indescribable and indeterminable nature of this wholeness. The paradoxical qualities of the term are a reflection of the fact that wholeness consists partly of the conscious man and partly of the unconscious man, but we cannot define the latter or indicate his boundaries. Hence, in its scientific usage, the term self refers neither to Christ nor to the Buddha, but to the totality of the figures that are its equivalent, and each of those figures is a symbol of the self. This mode of expression is an intellectual necessity in scientific psychology, and in no sense denotes a transcendental prejudice. On the contrary, as we have said before, the objective attitude enables one man to decide in favor of the determinate Christ, another in favor of the Buddha, and so on. Those who are irritated by this objectivity should reflect that science is quite impossible without it. Consequently, by denying psychology the right of objectivity, they are making an untimely attempt to extinguish the light of a science. So here he's saying that if you don't allow this, then you're denying life, because our psyche is alive. Even if such a preposterous attempt were to succeed, it would only widen the already catastrophic gulf between the secular mind on the one hand and the church and religion on the other. And so I guess my point is that where he dropped the ball and where Dr. Ulanoff picked it up is that we can't have a world where there's all rationality and no life, okay? And so, it's easy to put down the side of life by saying, oh, it's irrational, or oh, it's feminine, or any number of other put downs. Oh, it's good versus evil. Oh, it's evil. Oh, it's light versus dark. Okay, all those opposites were used to put down the side of life. But we have to think now, because we can't live entirely on this rationality, exclusive rationality side. We just can't do that anymore. So anyway, I'm glad to see that a few of you are still here. It has seemed like a bit of a soliloquy tonight, but I'm certainly welcome any questions that you might have. I will try to go a little bit further here. It is quite understandable for a science to concentrate more or less exclusively on its subject. Indeed, that it is its absolute raison d'etre. Since the concept of the self is of central interest in psychology, the latter naturally thinks along lines diametrically opposed to theology. For psychology, the religious figures point to the self, whereas for theology, the self points to its, that is, theology's own central figure. And so, in other words, theology might possibly take the psychological self as an allegory of Christ. This opposition is no doubt very irritating, but unfortunately inevitable unless psychology is to be denied the right to exist at all. I therefore plead for tolerance, nor is this very hard for psychology, since as a science it makes no totalitarian claims, unlike the theologians who do make such claims. So, anyway, this is a real-world problem, because as long as we think that only our side is right, only our dogma is right, then we're going to go on killing one another in the name of religion. But if we start to understand that the same psychological factors were coming up in all religions, then we can look and see what we have in common and what we can learn from one another. For example, what could be wrong with praying 5 times a day? Okay, in Islam, it's quite normal to pray 5 times a day, and if you do that, you take a time out from your busy life and the crazy things that are going on around you, and just give your mind a chance to recharge at the very minimum. And I often do that by lying down and taking a nap for 10 or 15 minutes. That can be a kind of prayer too. And so, I'm not saying that there should be a dogma that says you have to pray 5 times a day. I'm not sure that number is the right number, but I do think that it's not a bad idea. And then vis-a-vis Buddhism, for example, the central idea in Buddhism is to meditate, to let your mind actually recharge, reconnect, and take the stress off of it. And that seems a pretty good idea too. I would meditate very often, and so I think that is a useful thing that Christians can take from Buddhism. And indeed, many Christians and Jews are also Buddhist, and they don't find that very difficult, because if you look at the differences in the approaches, Buddhism isn't strictly a religion in the sense of the Western religions, because there's no heaven, there's no hell, there's no apostles, there's no saints, there's no sinners, and there's no God, and there are no angels, there are no devils, there's actually no good or evil, and so by letting your mind just relax into those kinds of openness, it can change your perspective on things. And so you could think of it this way. Suppose that we had a map of the United States where the red states are marked in red and the blue states are marked in blue. But what we do is we rise up above and look down at the United States as a country, and think of it as in terms of it's one country, and it has the American people as its people. And then you can start to see how things run together. Now, In wartime, this happens naturally. So, in other words, there's no politics allowed in the military. It's actually a violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice to do things in a political manner in the U.S. military. And the reason is that we all have to work together, and we all have to be Americans together, and we all have to have sworn the same oath and believe in the inviolability of the Constitution of the United States. That's what all of us do who've taken an oath to serve in the U.S. military. And so the faith or the political positions of the person that's in the third rank of the squad or the platoon, the third rank of the platoon, it doesn't matter that of the three squads, one's Christian, one's Jews, and one's Muslims. That would never happen because we don't decide things that way in the military. But, just suppose that you had such a platoon, it's still a platoon, and it still has to do the things that it needs to do in order to preserve and protect the Constitution of the United States. And all members of that platoon, regardless of faith, regardless of political stripe, etc., have to do that. And that's what we all swear an oath to do, as do all public officials in the United States. Now, obviously, some public officials have a little different views of how they, let's say, behave with those requirements. But in the military, there's no question, okay? There's no question. Everybody does their job in the way that they are required to do based on their orders. And so we have to think about these issues in sort of a wider perspective, from a satellite level thinking. I mean, my wife's favorite, her favorite imagery is if we have two political leaders who are at each other's throats, the answer is to send them up in a satellite for 30 days and with 30 days worth of air, and they either solve their differences or they come home dead. And that's sort of an interesting image, Send them to the space station and we're not going to bring you home until you've solved all the world's problems. And so somehow the symbol will present itself, the symbol of the answer would present itself in that case because it's mandatory. So anyway, let's see where we are. So I guess that I will stop at this point. There is more. We're about halfway through this discussion of the introduction to the religious and psychological problems of alchemy. And so here, Dr. Jung is basically trying to explain what the issues are. And then when we get past paragraph 43, we're currently at paragraph 22, then we will be going into the dreams of Wolfgang Pauli, who was a Nobel Prize winning physicist and who presented fresh dreams to Jung that could be compared with alchemical dreams from the Middle Ages. And that is a very interesting study, and we'll probably start that within, let's see, we probably will start that by the second week in March, I suppose. I will try to get through the rest of this material over the next 2 weeks. So, is there any other comment, thought, question, anything at all before I terminate the session for tonight? Since I haven't had any comments or questions, I'm sort of wondering whether everybody has just turned on their recorder and hasn't really been interacting with the live stream. And so it's a bit challenging for me to have to do all the talking or all the thinking in connection with these live streams. So I do see that there are still quite a number of you online. If any of you would like to make a comment or ask a question, please do, even if you want to disagree with me or disagree with Dr. Jung and what he was saying in these first paragraphs of Psychology and Alchemy, volume 12 of the collected works of C.G. Jung. Anything at all. Okay. In that case, I think I will wrap it up for tonight. But I appreciate you being here very much, as I do each week. And because you're here, it makes it possible for me to think that what I'm doing is important. And obviously your comments that are positive are very welcome. The ones that are critical are often correct. Okay, if you say that I'm a bad reader, then yeah, I guess I would have to accept that. And certainly in some people's perspective, I'm not a particularly great reader, and I don't claim to be that. But obviously I pay attention to everyone's comments, and I try to respond to everyone. And so if you have any comments later on or want to add anything, please feel free to do that, not only in the chat, but also in the commentary underneath this video. So I'm going to discontinue for tonight, but I will be back again next week and we'll carry on. I'll go as fast as I can through the rest of this material. So talk to you soon.